Yeah, I'm coming. Alright. Hey, that doesn't look too bad. A little twisted and all, but other than that, it's okay. So, I started this game designer's spotlights, whatever you want to say, and certainly the Richard Berg one was quite popular. But now I'm, and then I looked at and did the Francis Tresham one, and, well, significantly less popular. Don't know why in particular, but there's probably a lot more wargamers out there than XX lovers or Civ lovers nowadays. And of those that there are, they may not, well, real XX lovers will, but of all the people who've enjoyed Civilization, probably a great deal of them don't know what he designed, who the designer was. But then I started thinking, all right, this is supposed to be people who are personally really important to me and my gaming evolution, and as well, perhaps, to the world of gaming at the same time. To what extent I'm going to do that, that's hard to tell. But when I started thinking about that and thinking back, well, other than those first few war games, soon after buying them, I went to a place called, this was in Paramus, New Jersey area, the Highway Hobby Shop, or Highway Hobby House, or something like that. They had a lot of trains and stuff. Somehow or another, I'm not sure why I went there the first time. Maybe my father found out that there were some of those games there, because I was already into the war games at this point. And I went, and there were a bunch of Avalon Hill games there. Well, there were Avalon Hill games near me in my mall. What there were not there, and I had hoped that there were for some reason, were SPI games. And they just didn't have any. And I have no idea. At that time, I knew of nowhere I could get them. I wasn't in New Jersey. I was in Orange County, New York, actually, at that point in my life. And at the toy store in the Orange Plaza had... actually, I don't know if I had even gone there and found that yet. So I think the Highway Hobby House was the first place I looked that had games. And maybe I found it in a magazine or something. I have no idea how I made that link that they would have the games that I expected them to. And I found the Avalon Hill games there. And I went up to the store owner and said, hey, or whoever was keeping shop, do you carry any SPI games? And he said, no. Man, I kind of looked at some of the Avalon Hill ones and thought, I mean, it's a big deal for me to go talk to someone. And he suggested Dungeons & Dragons. And that's where we are here. Because for me, a huge element in my gaming evolution has been role-playing. And there's nowhere to start with that other than with good old Gary Gygax. The effect he has had on my gaming, on the hobby as a whole, what used to be called the adventure gaming hobby. But, you know, role-playing has almost completely diverged. I mean, it really had, maybe by the time I had gotten into it, largely diverged from the wargaming roots that it started in. But it's funny, because when you look at Gary Gygax's credits, well, he's got credits for some minis games, you know? Chainmail, obviously. A few others, some simple stuff like Don't Give Up This Ship. I think it's a naval minis game. I haven't looked at it too carefully. But, you know, minis were a major side of wargaming before even Avalon Hill came into the picture. And then maybe the kind of, I don't know, a sort of symbiosis may have developed where some of these simple board war games helped spark an interest into those who wanted more to go into the minis side. And this has changed over time. I found many minis players have become more towards the lighter side of things when I was more into the hobby, or later in my period of the hobby. But anyway, I'm just kind of projecting and making guesses here because I wasn't really around at this point. You know, I'm old enough, but my gaming hobby days started at a later date. So from chainmail came this idea of, what if we kind of made this fantasy-like? And these are almost like one person swinging anyway. The chainmail combat system is not too different from the D&D combat system, to tell you the truth. And it really isn't that big a jump to go from, oh, these are 10 guys or 20 guys each, to this is one person fighting one orc. But that jump was a huge one in terms of the effect it had on the hobby, because D&D just caught fire. Added two things. One, that really personal element. This is my dude with his sword, you know, fighting. And then the fantasy side, the magic, the monsters, all this, that, and the other, which just opened up this whole new world. Now for me, I brought home my little basic set box. That's where I started. I didn't start with the 3 original books. One of my original gaming companions had been offered 2 options when he went to a game store, maybe a different one, probably the one in the mall, and he looked at the 3 D&D original books versus the Battle of 5 Armies, and ended up buying the Battle of 5 Armies, and we played that a couple of times, and it wasn't terribly good. Now, Gygax doesn't have a lot of board gaming credits, and I don't know a lot of them beyond that. He's got a few things like Dungeon that I played that was just a horrible game. Kind of like a bad Talisman. It didn't have the fun of Talisman to it. Whatever that may be. But it was worse. But there are a couple of interesting key ones. One is Alexander the Great, of all things. The old Avalon Hill Classic. This is a Gary Gygax design. I remember noticing this before and saying, whoa, what's up with that? Yeah, apparently this was something he designed under another company, and Avalon Hill bought it out and said, hey, this is a cool game. Let's put, clean it up a little bit and make it workable, and put it on the in our line. And it's actually still an interesting game. I played it not all that long ago. It's not a detailed tactical study in the way Great Battles of History is, of course, but it is kind of interesting. I think it had a little bit more meat and flavor to it than, say, GDW's Raffia. Less fun because, well, Raffia is just incredibly cool with the elephants flying around and everything. It's such a light game. This isn't much heavier, but it's got an interesting concept, different size pieces. It's I think this may be the first game that has that, I'm not sure. But you've got, really big pieces for the big phalanxes, down to single hex, smaller pieces, and then, actually everything may be single hex, I'd have to break it out to see. But there's definitely this physical difference, and there's a difference in the stacking if they are that way. You're allowed to stack like 2 small pieces or 1 big piece or something. And then you get these little circular leaders who can run around. And it's just really, really a cool use. Something that's very fitting for the miniatures type mind to have come across for that conversion. A conversion that I think gets, to its fullest in the mid-70s with SPI. I blame Berg for that with TSS, but maybe TSS isn't the first. It's got to be right in there. But there's another big game that I forget about. They came out at the same time, which was the Wellington's victory. I forget about it because I'm only used to the TSR box, the reprint, but essentially the same game was there in much prettier components, other than the box, perhaps. The box for the TSR version is hideous, but at least it's a box. Those flat trays just don't do me. Anyway, totally going off base here, and anybody who's, really interested in Gary Gygax is saying, what the fuck is this guy talking about? Well, yeah, this is what I do. All right, so really intriguing that there's this cool game translating the minis experience of an ancient battle, which I don't know of other things out there. I'm sure there are. I'm sure that there were other little self-published or small companies putting out stuff when they started seeing, if my mind, at whatever age it was, and it had to be fairly young, like 7 or something, looking at Origins of World War II, said, ooh, I bet you I could do something with little soldiers in a sandcastle with one of these little CRT things, and too bad I don't have dice, how can I do this without dice? I forgot to bring anything like that. If my mind could think of that at that age, I'm sure that slightly older and brighter people could come up with better translations of what they were doing. People who were already in the minis said, hey, there's some advantages to putting things on a board. I'm not sure quite what they are, but certainly as you want to grow the scale, a board starts to become more interesting, I think, than miniatures. Anyway, but nobody moved that way. Nobody moved to the operational side with the ancients or medievals or anything. Anyway, we have that move from chainmail to D&D. And, D&D just grabbed not just the gaming hobby. I'm sure, from what I understand from people I've had conversations with on The Geek, it swept a number of the already, hey, we're into these war games. Whoa, this is interesting. This is cooler, actually. It definitely swept some of that. But then, by the time I was entering the hobby, the vast majority of people who had any exposure to adventure gaming were pure role players. And I found a number of them were willing to take on other games. The expansion went role-playing, then to what I'd consider a gateway game like Civilization, see the Tresham video, and then finally into the wargaming side, if they were inclined that way. And the wargaming side, in some cases, would jump first. Sometimes you would go from the D&D to the Ogre, SFB, stuff like that, which right away starts getting you into the correct sort of mindset to handle these very complex games and these rigid rule sets and legalese and all that. Not so much with Ogre, but certainly by the time you get to SFB, you're dealing with a full-blown rule set that's, fairly intimidating even with the small set compared to, I don't know, some of those light early Avalon Hill games. So D&D had a humongous impact on the hobby, and the sweep that it had caused companies like SPI, like Avalon Hill, to reach out and say, oh, can we do role-playing games? And, certainly at SPI, I'm not so sure at Avalon Hill, what the sort of funneling of how a game got into the Avalon Hill kind of suite of games. But at SPI, it was clear that there was at least a contingent of people there who were role players. They were into the role-playing games, and they were producing role-playing games because they loved them, and they were designing it based on their really crazy campaign, which, didn't carry over quite as well as, say, the D&D Greyhawk world that kind of felt like, yeah, this is, believable in some ways. It may not be too detailed in a lot of cases. that grew later. It may have this sort of generic feel to it because it was the first and it kind of defined what the generic would be, right? Because everything that copied D&D started taking these same things. Elves, which are kind of Tolkienish elves, immortal, blah, blah, blah. Dwarves, love gold, love beer, whatever. But you also saw a whole industry formed with the role-playing games where I don't know how many different role-playing games TSR spawned out. Most of them less detailed than D&D was, especially less detailed than where Advanced D&D ended up going. It opened up this whole new idea, though, where it wasn't just a tactical situation. It was more about the dungeon master, game master, if you like, providing a situation for other people to have fun in. It was less competitive, it was more cooperative, and maybe the roots to the cooperative game are kind of laid there. I'm not saying they wouldn't happen anyway, I'm just saying that it would give a boost if you're used to the cooperative aspect of the role-playing game. And then say, well, what if we kind of work for that in a board game as well? Of course, not all role-playing games were cooperative, but a big hunk of it was, yeah, here you are, you're sitting in a tavern, and hey, there's a bad guy, and there's lots of treasure there. You go raid his castle, and you can have what you want. Just make sure you kill him, okay? And we'll give you some money for that, too. So, in the end, for me, I moved towards different role-playing games, but I played a lot of D&D. In my high school years, I have to say, I played maybe 2-3 years. A fairly significant amount of D&D, largely because even though I had been exposed to other systems and some of the players in my group had been, it was sort of the common ground, and that was where the characters were already built up. I was brought in to run a game with people who already had established characters because their dungeon master had left. And even though I was much more excited by, say, RuneQuest or Traveler or what ended up hooking me, but one of my friends had at the time, Rollmaster. These were the games, to me they were more detailed, more realistic, more correct. Now, you could say Traveler's not more detailed, but we'll get into that later, but it felt more realistic to me. And others like Paranoia, which felt realistic even though they were maybe at a more abstract level. Still, D&D is the thing that spawned all of these. And it was the one that went to Sears. You could see it in the Sears catalog. You could see it at the bookstores, the local bookstores. It was the one game that you could kind of count on finding in any mall. I'm not sure you can anymore. Probably. But there are other things that have taken its place. But I've had this long experience of role-playing because, perhaps, of finding this one game. And likewise, the hobby as a whole. Would role-playing have happened without Gygax making that jump? I don't know. I really don't know. Would it have followed anywhere near the same course? Probably not. Probably we would have seen a very different flow and maybe less captivating. There was this marketing engine. There was this, I don't know if it's Gygax himself, but whatever he created in TSR ended up being this really powerful engine, the way, say, Games Workshop is with their minis. Speaking of Games Workshop and Gygax, the first mini system that I actually think I owned was not Chainmail, but the old Swords and Spells, which was sort of the D&D, the D&D-ification of Chainmail. There may have been some simplifications in it as well, but it basically said, hey, you know, you can go to that 10-to-1 scale for most of your pieces. You have some heroic pieces that are really, you know, more than that. And I believe units fought in formation, and they could add together their variants, etc. And overall, it was so much of a more elegant solution than what Games Workshop came up with. But it was too much of a minis game to appeal, maybe. So the lesson that was learned with D&D, which was, you know, you don't have to get it right, just get it simple enough that anybody can do it, and they can get hooked into it. That was lost with Sword and Spells. And then the later TSR battle system, whoever put that out, felt like a simplification of the old Swords and Spells, but just, again, kind of flavorless and didn't really catch things in the same way that the Games Workshop stuff did. And Games Workshop had its leap at that point on the minis market. It had won already, as far as I can tell with that. There isn't a lot more to say. You know, I feel like the man completely shifted the hobby. You had this maybe initial divergence pulling away from the old school wargamers, but overall he grew the adventure hobby tremendously. And in some ways, I blame the Avalon Hill and the SPI for not reaching out and producing the right games. What you see, let's take a brilliant example. Magic Realm, considered this great, brilliant game by everybody now. Well, those rules were inaccessible, okay? They really were. And the game itself has its issues too. There's Wizards, barely playable rules to try to cross that gap from back from the fantasy to the wargaming world. Stuff like Ogre succeeded. Stuff like Titan succeeded, but it doesn't bring you towards anything else. Titan is this little standalone oddity sitting out there. So, in a lot of ways, I hold the wargaming world's attempts to reach out as not being successful enough. I think the SPI crew, who really loved wargaming and role-playing, would have been the right group to do it, except they perhaps just didn't get the mass appeal side of it. You gotta appeal to the lowest common denominator. Grab these people and pull them in. And that was something that D&D really managed. I mean, it wasn't going for anybody, but it was going for a much wider audience. And, you know, you would go to gaming conventions, there would be these tons of people playing D&D, and you could pull them away, and if you taught them another game that had some interest for them, they would play it. But they weren't getting exposed to it directly. Just seeing something that was more like a war game, even if they bought it, they probably looked at the rules and said, the concepts to this just don't work. There wasn't that good introductory level to move them from the fantasy games that they were playing, where really their hand is being held by the GM the whole time, to the war game. And I think that was a real mistake. Now later, you saw a lot less capability to move people. Once you got, you know, I had this hope for the Magic that the collectible card game Magic would like provide this same kind of impetus, this same revitalization of the hobby and pushing things in. And in some ways, I think it did in terms of game design. But in terms of grabbing people, it wasn't the same. Magic players had their crack. It was not like D&D. D&D, you had to sift for a long time. You had these long, open-ended campaigns available. The players there were more available to be moved into the other games that were coming out at the same time, or that already existed prior to it. Anyway, I don't know how much I got there, but yeah, we'll load it, see what we get.